We are now in the process of defeating the radical left, the Marxists, the anarchists, the agitators, the looters.
As anti-racism protests continue, U.S. President Donald Trump slams what he calls enemies from within. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. President Trump railed against what he called a radical assault on the American way of life in two speeches over the July 4th holiday weekend. Behind in the polls and failing to control the spread of COVID-19, the president cast himself as waging a battle against what he called a new far-left fascism, one that endangers American values and seeks to erase history. For more, we turn now to CGTN's Jim Spellman. He's at the White House. And Jim, this was a pretty fierce frontal assault against a growing movement in the United States. That movement, of course, in response to the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. What can you tell us about the president's speeches over the weekend?
It's really about doubling down on the culture wars in an attempt to rile up his base by using what he calls an appeal to American heritage. So here's what we're seeing. President Trump not quite going there, but coming pretty close to supporting the Confederate flag, Confederate statues. He criticized NASCAR for banning the Confederate flag in the stands at their races. And there are at least two professional sports teams that have names that are considered racist by many Native Americans. Those teams under pressure to change their names, President Trump tweeting that it would be weak if they were to do that, all in an attempt to contrast himself and his movement with liberal Democrats. Here's a little of what President Trump said Friday at Mount Rushmore.
Against every law of society and nature, our children are taught in school to hate their own country and to believe that the men and women who built it were not heroes, but that were villains. The radical view of American history is a web of lies. All perspective is removed. Every virtue is obscured. Every motive is twisted. Every fact is distorted. And every flaw is magnified until the history is purged and the record is disfigured beyond all recognition.
The White House says that part of this is an attempt by President Trump to stand up for his followers, who he claims are often unfairly accused of being racist. Anand?
Jim, now that other big challenge in the United States and around the world, of course, President Trump has been criticized for his handling of the pandemic. What did he have to say about it over the weekend?
Well, President Trump and his re-election campaign have clearly decided that his response to COVID-19 is not a winning issue. So they're trying to reframe how we talk about it, how we think about it. Over the weekend, President Trump saying inaccurately that 99% of cases in the U.S. are, quote, totally harmless. Critics say the president's not taking this seriously enough. The White House, though, pointing out that the rate of deaths is not going up the same way cases have been. That's true. And they point to progress being made towards a vaccine, saying that could be done later this year or early in 2021. Look, 3 million cases will be in the U.S. in a matter of hours or days. There's no getting around that. But the Trump administration and his re-election campaign seem to want Americans to realize that this is simply the new normal, and they hope to go on to talk about other issues. Anand?
Thanks, Jim. That's CGTN's Jim Spellman reporting from the White House. Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Amy Holmes is a journalist and writer for HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher. She joins us from New York. With us from Aurora, Illinois, is political analyst Steve Chaggaris. Joseph Williams is the senior news editor for U.S. News and World Report. He's right here in Washington, D.C. And joining us from Atlanta is Dr. Darria Long. She's an emergency room physician at the University of Tennessee's Erlanger Hospital. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Dr. Long, let me start with you. There were some alarming figures that we saw on the new coronavirus cases in the United States. In the first 5 days of this month, we had 3 of the largest daily totals with a total of 250,000 new cases. What's driving these numbers?
Yeah, Anand, you're right. We have seen significant rises in that. And I think it's largely driven by the fact that people are going back so quickly to many things that we've told them aren't a great idea to be doing, in terms of we've seen lots of people getting together in very large groups. And I think it's important to look at the case numbers, but also to look at the positivity rate, which is rising. And that shows that the cases are not just rising because we're testing more, but because more people are ill. And then we'll have to be watching very closely hospitalizations. Those are continuing to rise still. We're still under what we can handle, which is good, but we have to watch that because there's often about a 2 to 3 week delay from the diagnosis to when somebody ends up in the hospital.
Right, and Dr. Long, very quickly, what are we seeing in terms of hospitalizations and the number of people who are actually dying from the pandemic?
So to look at hospitalizations, again, where the numbers are rising, undoubtedly, and specifically in pockets, like Houston, for instance. But those are continuing to rise. Again, we can still handle it. It's under hospital capacity, but that's really crucial that we cannot surpass that. Death rates are actually improving, but that's not so much as a fact of the cases and the hospitalizations. It's more a factor of that we're learning how to handle this disease that we had not seen 6 months ago. We're learning different technologies and ways to treat patients the best way possible.
Right, and Darria, we also heard from our reporter telling us a moment ago that President Trump also talked about the pandemic over the weekend. He talked specifically about testing and a vaccine. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Now we have tested almost 40 million people. By so doing, we show cases, 99% of which are totally harmless. We are now doing unbelievably well and are in deep testing on vaccines, treatments, and therapeutics. We'll likely have a therapeutic and/or vaccine solution long before the end of the year.
So, Dr. Long, as our reporter told us, a lot of this has to do with politics. From a scientific perspective, what do you make of it?
Yeah, and politics is something as a physician, and we in medicine, we can't afford to step into that. We have to look at the data. Let me first correct what I think that statement was trying to say, is that they say there's a 99% survival rate, a 1% mortality rate. But that doesn't include the people who end up in the ICU, who end up hospitalized, who end up sickened by this. So you can't just say that it's 99% harmless. And just to give a context, 99% survival rate is what the 5-year survival rate is for non-invasive localized breast cancer. I don't think you could tell any of those women who survived that it was a harmless experience. We cannot equate mortality or lack of mortality with harmlessness.
Steve Chaggaris, this has become such a hot-button political issue. Over the weekend, the Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, Dr. Stephen Hahn, he refused to back at least President Trump on those numbers. He said, I'm not going to get into who's right and who's wrong. So what is the political calculation for the president in making these kinds of statements?
Well, I mean, he doesn't believe the polling, which shows that Americans are growing concerned or have been concerned about coronavirus since the beginning. He feels that there is a group of people who really want to push back on what the narrative is about this virus. And so he continues to go out there and suggest you don't need to wear masks, and continues to hold public events in which people are not wearing masks and are not taking precautions. And again, he's playing to a smaller percentage than I think actually exists. But he, for some reason, believes that there's a larger percentage that exists and that agrees with him on this stuff. And I think if you see, it's not just coronavirus, but other issues he's dealing with. He's playing to what he believes there's a silent majority. There's people that aren't saying that they agree with him, but he believes that they agree with him. I think that's just what we're seeing on this coronavirus.
Joseph Williams, we've seen a large increase in the number of those infected in the state of Florida. Of course, that's a battleground state. We've also seen massive increases in the state of Texas. How does this play out politically for the president?
Not good in 2 words. Basically, you've got a battleground state in Florida that he narrowly won. You've got Texas, which was a solid red state that's turning kind of purple. But the effect of the coronavirus infection is really going to call that into question. You also have the president who is against mail-in voting, which certainly would make people feel a lot more safe and secure when they do go out to cast their ballots. Even some Republicans are telling him, listen, don't go hard against mail-in ballots because it's hurting us in states that like mail-in balloting. So I don't think he's got a very good story to tell here, and that may be why he's doubling down on these remarks that gin up and agitate his base. Certainly he really can't afford to go broad because his path is getting much more narrow by the day, especially as the coronavirus rates increase.
All right, let's bring in Amy Holmes from New York. Amy, turning back to President Trump's two speeches over the weekend, he went after what he called the radical left, calling them out for what he called a cancel culture, quote unquote. Here's the president talking at Mount Rushmore. Let's listen.
One of their political weapons is cancel culture, driving people from their jobs, shaming dissenters, and demanding total submission from anyone who disagrees. This is the very definition of totalitarianism, and it is completely alien to our culture and to our values, and it has absolutely no place in the United States of America.
So, Amy, what do you make of what the president has been saying? Is this a part of some calculated strategy here?
You know, I think it's interesting. I listened to all 40-some minutes of the Mount Rushmore speech, and Trump's speeches are almost like a perfect and predictable Rorschach test for the media. So he gave those, hot button, red meat, incendiary rhetoric that the right loves to hear, but he also spent 20-some minutes talking about the four men on Mount Rushmore, their great deeds, their exploits, their contribution to the United States. He also, had a laundry list of other great Americans that he listed. But when it comes to what the president is trying to do, I think what he's trying to do is speak to a growing concern among a lot of Americans that what started out as reasonable protests against police violence, police brutality, the murder of George Floyd that was so upsetting to all Americans, that seemed to morphosize into this mindless type of violence and tearing down of statues, including Ulysses S. Grant. There was vandalism at the Lincoln Memorial, and my personal favorite was a memorial in Washington, D.C. of the founder of the Rotary Club that was spray painted by vandals, probably racist. They didn't even take time to Google. So there are a lot of Americans who are very concerned about what they see as a growing culture of cancel, of really indiscriminate attacks on American culture itself.
Joseph Williams, what did you make of that?
There's a lot there to unpack. I mean, first and foremost, the president does do a lot of stuff to trigger the media, but a lot of these false statements and these over-the-top claims, they have to be checked by the media, because otherwise they go out into the atmosphere and they are taken as truth by some people. And as far as cancel culture and his laundry list of great Americans, I mean, come on. I mean, let's be honest. The real attention getters in the speech were the things that he said, because he knew that they were calling directly out to his supporters. I mean, he's no longer using dog whistles. He's dog whistling into a bullhorn. And anybody who thinks that that's like the least objectionable part of his speech and what he really wasn't trying to say, I mean, I think they're kind of misreading the situation. So I think he's definitely trying to gin his base, mostly because if you pick a battleground state, almost any battleground state, he's running behind. His path is narrow. He believes he has to get to his base and get them fired up, get to the polls, and this is an easy, kind of almost lazy way of doing it.
Dr. Long, getting back to the pandemic, President Trump says he believes that there will be a vaccine by the end of this year. We've heard and seen reports that scientists in China, Germany, Britain, and the United States are working on a promising but as yet unproven new generation of vaccine technologies that's based on something called RNA, reportedly cheaper, faster. What do we know about it?
Yeah, you're right, Anand. So there are actually about 3 companies and a couple other places that are using this RNA technology. And it is very intriguing because it can allow to get a product into testing much faster. But it's an unproven technology. To date, there are absolutely no RNA vaccines on the market, and not for lack of trying. There's been attempts at that. So, and in addition, even if they find out that they can make an effective vaccine, production of nucleic acids, the NA of RNA, is one of the more challenging things to do. So even if they find that target and it is effective and it creates immunity, being able to produce it at scale is going to be very challenging. So I think in any vaccine race, very few of all the vaccine targets actually make it to market. I'm not sure it's anyone's game at this point. And I think there will be a number of vaccines that actually do make it to market in the end. And we'll have a situation kind of like the flu, where we have a number of different flu vaccines. Some work better for certain subtypes of people. Will RNA vaccine be one of them? We don't yet know.
Steve, the virus has claimed 130,000 lives in the United States, and as Jim Spellman, our reporter, pointed out earlier on, it could be 3 million people confirmed infected cases in a matter of hours or in a matter of days. The president's likely opponent in the November election, Joe Biden, has been talking about the toll that the virus has been taking. Let's listen to what he had to say.
It didn't have to be this way. Month after month, as other leaders in other countries took the necessary steps to get the virus under control, Donald Trump failed us. Month after month, as many of us urged him to step up and do his job, he failed us.
So, Steve, has Joe Biden figured that this could be a winning strategy for him?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question that polling has consistently shown that people do not approve with how the president has handled the coronavirus. And frankly, you see it in the president's own words on this. He's trying to move forward. He's trying to downplay the seriousness of it. He's trying to focus on other things, whether it's racial issues that the country is dealing with, or, for instance, today he talked about how he thinks that schools should open this fall, regardless of the debates that are going on about whether it's safe to send kids back to school. And so, you know, Joe Biden, again, as somebody who's not in public office right now, it's a little bit easier for him to come out and criticize the president's handling of us, but it's also easy to criticize him because he has the American people behind him on this in terms of polling. The other part of Biden's strategy as well is to pick and choose the fights that he wants to take to the president, mainly because the president makes so much news on his own that it almost doesn't matter what Joe Biden is saying at this point, because Trump is really sucking most of the air in terms of what's going on with his campaign and the messaging in this campaign.
Joseph, we've been talking about the polling. I've been looking at some of them. There was a New York Times Siena poll that was done. It shows that President Trump's lead, very commanding lead that he had among white voters, is almost completely evaporated. Research, at least CNBC Change research polls, also show that Joe Biden is in the lead in key battleground states. Do you sense that there is an acknowledgement in the Trump campaign that he's in trouble right now?
I think clearly the rhetoric that he's talking about, some of the more outrageous claims that he's made, certainly speak to that. And as I mentioned earlier, you pick a battleground state, he's behind. Pennsylvania, Florida, Wisconsin, they're all quite worried inside the Trump campaign about the fact that he's running behind in states that he narrowly won, or in states that should be in his pocket outright. And in that regard, I'm talking Arizona and Georgia. The Trump campaign is spending ad money in those places because they're running behind in the polls. And to extrapolate a little bit, to broaden the lens a little bit, is because he doesn't have a really good story to tell here. What Steve said and what Amy said both are about him trying to make a case to voters, but he doesn't really have the facts on either one. The economy is still suffering, even though there was a slight rebound. Unemployment is still in double digits. And the coronavirus, we're about ready to cross our 300,000th fatality. Those are things that Americans are quite worried about, not flags, not monuments. So until he kind of realizes that that's the case, and until the facts prove him otherwise, he's in a bit of trouble here that I think is going to take a while to dig himself out of.
Amy, as we hear... Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to point out that I think the basis for a lot of what the president was saying on the 4th of July and on the 3rd of July about monuments and flags and all of this stuff is he is looking at the polls and he's seeing that he's lost support among older voters. He's lost support among suburban voters. He's lost support among male voters and white voters. And I think that he is, in his gut, is looking at those numbers and saying, this is a way I can attract these people back, get these people back on my side. I'm not sure it's really going to work that way, but I think that's his strategy at this point, looking at these numbers really atrophying in the last several months.
But Steve, how does he get them back? Because if we look at the numbers of people, for instance, being infected by the coronavirus, that number's going up.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big difficulty here. He has no good story to tell on a coronavirus. That is the biggest issue that I think that is facing the country right now, and the lingering issues from it, which is the economy, right? He doesn't have a good answer for both of those issues right now. And that's why I think you see him trying to move forward on coronavirus and downplay it. And then on the economy, really sort of crossing his fingers and hoping that as things open up, that the economy is going to shoot back up and it's going to reflect positively on him and his stewardship of the economy. But right now that's not happening. And so I think you see him moving toward these other issues to try to speak to these voters that were with him in 2016, that chose him over Hillary Clinton, and are now backing Biden at this point.
Amy, if we look at these numbers, these polling numbers, the president is in a hole, so why does he keep digging?
Well, that's your interpretation, that he's digging. He would say that his Mount Rushmore speech, he was trying to wrap himself in the flag of patriotism and trying to appeal to what he considered to be, widely shared values. But he is in trouble. His latest approval rating is at 38%. But Michael Dukakis, he just came out with a statement in the past few days who said, whoa, 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 Democrats, do not get ahead of yourselves. At this time in 1998, in his campaign, he was 17 points ahead of George Bush. And as we know, George Bush beat Dukakis handily, and Dukakis is best known as Snoopy in the Army tank. So I think it's interesting that Biden's strategy, as Terry McAuliffe himself said out loud, was to stay in the basement, not be seen. His polls go down the more the public sees him. Let Donald Trump make his mistakes, make the tweet that he did today about Bubba and NASCAR and flags, which stepped on his message over the 4th of July. Donald Trump has quite the talent for stepping on his own message, which I'm sure is very frustrating to his campaign. His campaign communications director just said today that if Donald Trump pivots to issues about the economy, he thinks they do have a strong message, particularly if the economy rebounds and looks better in October than it does today. But Donald Trump doesn't have a lot of discipline when it comes to campaign messaging.
So which is why Joe Biden needs to stay in the basement, because Donald Trump is doing a lot of the work for him. And as far as the economy is concerned, it is a finger crossed situation because the virus is going to get the last word. It simply is. When we open back up, cases start going up because there's no national strategy. So I think even trying to make the economy your selling card to the American voters in the fall is going to be fraught with peril, because the economy opens up, jobs get back on track, the virus comes back in, states have to shut down again.
But the problem is that we don't know what the quality of infection means. And the doctor on the show, I think, can talk about this a little bit more. Yeah. I live here in New York City. I am in coronavirus central. I don't want to get on the subway. I don't know what my risks are. And I don't know if I were to contract it, if I would be asymptomatic, if I would have a terrible flu-like symptoms for a week, or if I would be set back in the hospital with a ventilator for 3 weeks. This is something that is so frustrating that we don't have a real firm grip on. And the New York Times just had a piece over the weekend where they said not even World Health officials themselves know the extent of the infection versus what we have on the books, on the record.
Right. Let me go to Dr. Long on that. Dr. Long, we also had new information published by the New York Times over the weekend. And in fact, the New York Times had to sue the Centers for Disease Control to get this information. It showed that African American and Latino people are being harmed by the virus at much higher rates, and patients from these two groups are twice as likely to die from the infection. How does one explain that disparity?
Yeah, absolutely, Anand. And I think Amy had some great questions before as well. To answer your question, Anand, yes, we are indeed seeing that. We are seeing more disease, and when these populations come into the hospital, they are sicker. And I think that is something we're trying to figure out exactly why, because studies have shown that once patients, whether they're Caucasian, white, black, Asian, Hispanic, are getting into the hospital, their survival rates are pretty close and pretty comparable. So it's not their hospital treatment, it's what they're coming in with. So we need to find this out. Are they coming in later because they have more challenging access to medical care? And for those same reasons, do they have more chronic health problems? We need to get to the root of the problem as opposed to just talking about the headline, because then we can actually drive change.
Steve, I want to get back to something Amy said a moment ago, and then, she referred to the 1998 election where Mike Dukakis had a 17-point lead, but actually lost the election. And as Amy pointed out, President Trump is banking on a resurgent economy to regain the lost ground. We are about 4 months away from the election. Do you see that happening?
There's no way to predict. There are 120 days between now and the election, and anything can happen. That's what the Trump folks are hoping at this point. But to compare it to 1988, Bush was the vice president for Ronald Reagan for 2 terms. He was coming off a pretty popular presidency and an administration. Trump is right now at 38% approval, and it's of his own doing. And it's something that he's going to have to turn around in 4 months for the American people, to explain to the American people why he deserves their vote for another 4 years. And right now, if the stories at all that are concerning Americans are coronavirus, the economy not rebounding, and even if it does rebound, you still have coronavirus to deal with, and the culture issues the culture wars we're dealing with. It's just, again, nothing's impossible, but these aren't issues that most presidents who are running for a second term want to deal with. They want to be able to dictate on their terms what their message should be. They want to be able to explain to people what they're going to be able to do for the next 4 years. He has been unable to do that because of the crises that he's had to deal with, and it just makes his job that much harder. And only 4 months to do that. I mean, anything can happen, but it's a tough road for him over the next 4 months.
Amy, go ahead. What's your response to that?
Oh, I was just going to add, Politico had a piece about a month and a half ago of an Obama economic advisor who was also warning Democrats that we could have a V-shaped recovery, and it's not to regain lost ground, but comparatively looking better in November than it does now. Not looking like it did last year, but better than now. So that Obama economic advisor was telling Democrats, when Americans are trying to weigh their choices, if the economy seems to be on an upswing, they might want to stick with President Trump. So Joe Biden can't necessarily sit on his laurels. He's going to have to make his case as well as why he should be president of the United States.
Joseph, very quickly, we've got about 40 seconds left. Is this election going to spin on the economy?
No, in a word, there are a lot of issues. If it were just the economy, absolutely. It is not the economy. It is the coronavirus. It is unrest in the streets because people are finally waking to the fact that there is inequality in the United States. If it were any one of those issues, it would still be a tough road to hoe. It is not any one of those issues. It is many. 180 days, a lifetime in politics, but very little time at the same time. So I think it's going to be all of the above, and I don't think he's got a very solid resume here.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us.